So today we're going to be talking about 1950s hair and makeup. So in the 1950s, we saw a huge surge of women who are now leaving factories, right? Because we weren't in a war anymore. We didn't have to worry about being in factories because all of the men were back from war. So we kind of saw a return back to the domestic life for a lot of women. And with this return to the domestic life, we also saw sort of this perfect housewife ideal be born, where women were always supposed to have every hair in place. They're supposed to look amazing, keep a perfect house while the man is at work. This still is sort of around, I think, these days, but was probably a lot more prominent. I think when we think kind of like housewife, a lot of us like instantly think like, oh, like 1950s housewife. So that's definitely something you're going to see, especially in the early years of the 1950s. Influential people in the 1950s. Christian Dior was making a lot of fashion in the 50s, and that's because of him and with his like new look that he created. This kind of like idealized the whole like hourglass shape, which is also something that I think a lot of us associate with the 1950s. Because we have people like Marilyn Monroe and Betty Page that came around in the 1950s, but then we also have our like Audrey Hepburn, Lucille Ball, we have Harry Belafonte, Eartha Kitt, Grace Kelly, Elvis Presley. There's a huge range of people, Elizabeth Taylor, James Dean. So it's really interesting because I think with like a lot of time periods that we've studied before this, we see that like, yes, there's like small variations in trends, but there's actually not like a huge variation. Most people were kind of following the same rules, and I really feel like in the 50s is when you see people sort of start to like break away from that, and you kind of see this rebellion that I don't think it has ended, right? Because I think currently we all have really like individual styles in our lives in 2020, and I think that you can almost start to like trace it back to the 50s as well. This is also when the civil rights movement started. So there's just so much like change occurring, and I really do think that you can see that reflected in the way that people chose to style themselves. So 1950s makeup, right? Cat eye eyeliner, that's probably one of the most iconic things that came out of the 50s. So we were kind of introduced to pinup girls in the 1940s, but really this iconic like pinup makeup that I think that we all think of, that was really kind of born in the 1950s. People started to wear tans. For a long time before this, it was really popular to be very pale a lot of times, right? But now people were like, you know, they're starting to go on vacations again. Life is starting to get a little bit better now that the war is over and people are home, so tans were getting popular. Men were tanning. There was such a thing as a fake tan for men called a man tan, so no one was excluded from this trend. There were more choices in a lot of the makeup that was around since we weren't involved in a war anymore, so red lipstick is not the only lipstick that people are wearing, right? So there's coral, there's orange, vivid pinks. People were loving to wear those kinds of colors too. As far as eyeshadows go, some research tries to say that like people wore really natural eyeshadows still. Others are say, well, this is the time when people were, you know, matching their eyeshadow to the outfit they were wearing, or their hair color, or their eye color. I think it probably just kind of depends on the situation that people were in, but I do think that we do see this kind of like perfect 1950s housewife who probably had everything matched from head to toe, right? So I don't think it would necessarily be wrong to put someone in makeup that does kind of match everything, or if you wanted to be more neutral, I don't think that would necessarily be wrong either. So I do think that you could kind of go in either direction with this period, and I do think that people probably kind of did wear both styles. As far as the kind of colors that people were wearing, you saw a lot of like blues, greens, pinks, and purples, which I also think was reflected in a lot of the fashion from this time period, so that kind of makes sense that those would be the trendier eyeshadow colors, right? People in the 50s in the beginning, they kind of had like more of like the natural brow that we saw in the 40s, but what was really interesting in the mid 50s is that people started to kind of shape their brows in a more defined way, and they actually had it so that the outer end of their brow started to go up a little bit, and it was like a really sharp upward angle. You'll see it in some photos, and you'll see like some of the pinup girls that had it too, but it's a really interesting look that I think a lot of people still do today, but it was definitely more of like a stylized look than we were seeing in the 40s and the early 50s. As far as women's hair went in the 1950s, we went through so many different looks in the 1950s, I feel. In the beginning, and I think not even necessarily in the beginning, more traditional 50s women, they were wearing their hair short and curly. So we weren't doing like the super long dramatic waves of the 40s anymore. We were kind of going a little bit more like short and proper, right? Because we could keep that in place really easily. Lucille Ball, she was really popular in the 50s. Everybody knows, for the most part, she was famous for all the curls that she had on the top of her head, right? So that's called the poodle. That's a really famous hairstyle from this period that I think people instantly kind of think of the 50s when you think of that, or you think of Lucille Ball, right? Blonde was still a very popular color. Film director Alfred Hitchcock was coming out with a lot of movies, and he has a huge reputation for putting icy cool blondes in it, and this actually became such a thing that it is referred to as Hitchcock blondes. So you will see a lot of that in the 50s. And then you kind of see people start to break away from this kind of like perfect housewife trope, though, with like their perfectly like short curly hair. Some teen girls in the 50s were a little bit more outgoing, and they would have ponytails, and you'd see them with scarves. A lot of times there were like little like chiffon scarves that they would wear around it. But then you also saw girls in the late 50s who had shorter hair. And a lot of times this was because they were part of sort of like the beatnik generation, which I think is something that a lot of people can associate Audrey Hepburn with, and how Audrey Hepburn would look. And then we also saw a lot of people in the late 50s, which did kind of have to do with like the beatnik generation. They started to straighten their hair, but they did not have hair straighteners like we do, right? So they would use actual irons to straighten their hair. So let's all be thankful that we have hair straighteners now. Short bangs were also popular during this time period. You'll see that on Audrey Hepburn. You'll see that on Betty Page. So you just really see like a huge, I feel like, range of what people looked like in the 50s. And really, like I was saying before, I think at this point is when you don't stop seeing that. So every time period from this point forward, there's just so many different ways that people looked. And you really just start to see that people are finally starting to like rebel a little bit and break away from the mainstream. And it's starting to be okay to be yourself, I feel, in the 50s once this all starts. Other people that were really popular in the 50s who had really iconic kind of like looks and hairstyles: Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor. I think we all know their sort of very like sensual like curls and everything that they had. They're very popular. The way they look is still super iconic, I think, in today's world. So I think a lot of us are very familiar with that. People still were wearing like fake buns and fake hair pieces. There's a really like famous cut called the Italian cut, which is sort of like a short, shaggy looking hairstyle. That was popular towards like the end, especially because you're going to see this more in like the 60s, but like towards like the end of the 50s, you would see women with these really stylized like bouffant hairstyles, which really means it was just like very large, very styled in place, with a lot of hairspray that they would have. So it's not necessarily like as intense as some of like the beehives that we're going to see in the 60s, but in the 50s you kind of started to see women where they would start to like shape their hair into those really like intensely hairsprayed and shellacked hairstyles. But it was sort of just like the beginning of that in the 1950s. And again, like I said, there's just such a variation. That is some of it, but as you look through photos, you're going to see even more variations, right? So that's why it's important to get all this information, but always look things up too, just because some of this might not make sense until you're looking at the research photos as well. As far as men's hair in the 50s, men started to kind of rebel a little bit in the 50s, right? It was still very conservative. There's still a lot of because right along with like the perfect housewife, there was like the perfect husband, right? Who goes to work and he has this very conservative haircut with his very conservative job and conservative briefcase and all of these things. But then we also see people like Elvis Presley, who started to become famous in the 1950s, and he was a huge deal, right? He was super rebellious. A lot of people who were very conservative could not handle the way that he presented himself and just how he acted, his looks, everything. But for a lot of young people, he was sort of like the beginning of kind of being able to rebel a little bit with what they looked like, and kind of realizing that they didn't have to follow this like really conservative path that the world had kind of seemed like was the only way to go for so long. People like him kind of helped them realize that there wasn't just one way that you could live your life and one way that you could look, right? So we all kind of know Elvis for his famous like pompadour hairstyle. So that became really popular. I think another thing that a lot of us think about when we think of the 1950s are like greasers, right? I'm sure a lot of us had to read books about this in school, and we're all kind of familiar with that wording, but the reason that a lot of times they got referred to as greasers was actually because of the hair product that they're putting in their hair, right? So they were using so much oil and hair product that they were greasy. They looked greasy. So that's why they started to call them greasers. And this was kind of like the more rebellious young men who were kind of looking in this like a greaser sort of style. They started to grow their hair out. They were fighting against the mainstream, so you saw that more, I feel like, in more of like a teenage rebellion phase than you necessarily did the perfect businessman going to work with his perfect briefcase, right? What's really cool about a lot of like the hairstyles that the greasers had is that a lot of them were like very, very stylized. So one that a lot of us are probably kind of familiar with seeing is the ducktail hairstyle, which definitely look up a photo of if you're not familiar with, so that you can kind of visualize it a little bit better. But basically the way that the hair was combed back on the sides of it, and the way it was parted down the center back of the head, it kind of resembled like the tail feather of a duck. So it sounds a little bit strange, I feel like, to explain in words, but if you look up a photo, it would probably make a little bit more sense. One way to really, like, I feel like, describe men's hair in the 1950s was it looked wet. Like I said, like, they used a lot of hair product. It was very greasy. So the wet look for men's hair was very popular. But obviously you're still going to have some people that were keeping their hair very short, so crew cuts were still very popular. So you still did see your more conservative men, but you were finally starting to see people, like, break away from that. As far as facial hair goes, people were generally clean shaven, but a lot of times some of our, like, less conservative, more rebellious friends probably had some beards and mustaches going on as well. So I would say, like, the biggest takeaway from the 1950s is just finally seeing people not be afraid to, like, rebel and to stand out from the crowd, because I think for so long in history we were taught to look a certain way and act a certain way, be a certain way, be a certain person. And I think finally in the 50s you started to see people realize, like, you don't actually have to live your life like that. So I think it's, like, a really interesting period to just kind of go back and see how, like, polar opposite some looks were, where you have your very, like, perfect housewife, perfect family, white picket fence people, but then you have, like, your greasers who are super rebellious. You have Elvis Presley. You have all these people that were standing up for their human rights and civil rights and everything. And it's just a really cool period to think about. And I don't think, like, especially with how many of us still, like, idolize, like, pinup girls and, like, Marilyn Monroe and, like, Elvis Presley and sort of the, like, rockabilly, like, 50s look that a lot of us are familiar with. I don't think that we think about a lot of, like, the history and, like, what all these people actually, like, starting to dress like this really meant. So I think it's a cool thing to kind of go back and learn a little bit about that, so you can kind of see the history behind all the things that we love so much.